So let's start. Maybe tell us a little bit about you, your background.
Yeah, so hi everybody. I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised in Brooklyn and Park Slope, before it was cool to push your strollers around there. Went to Stuyvesant High School, went to Stanford, studied a mix of kind of computer science and econ, and then came back to New York to work at Google here in Chelsea, and worked on a lot of our kind of structured data search efforts back then. So before,
as a product person, as a tech person?
Yeah, so on the product side. So I had done engineering, then tried design, and then found out that product was actually a pretty interesting kind of mix of all of those. So came to New York, and basically before there was a thing called the knowledge graph, before we had acquired this company called MetaWeb, we were working on just kind of building a more structured understanding from all the unstructured information on the web about what the world looks like, entities, relationships, facts, and then we started trying to figure out, could we start answering queries instead of with 10 blue links with actual answers that people were looking for. So the canonical example was, when was Barack Obama born, which Donald Trump was also kind of curious about, and then also things like Tom Hanks' best movies. So things that were kind of entity seeking or fact seeking. And then over time we realized, well, kind of relearning all this information from the web over and over again actually turned out to be quite brittle, and a lot of this information is actually quite evergreen. So what if we just actually got that canonical store of information, which is why we bought this company called MetaWeb, which basically had a ETL plus human curation pipeline from Wikipedia to build kind of a canonical graph of entities and relationships in the world, which we then kind of merged with the web index, and then we're able to start actually doing this at a much bigger scale. So I was there for a couple of years, and then went to Foursquare here in New York when it was still quite small, and kind of joined because I was excited about, back then, smartphones were taking off, people were really excited about what you could do with location awareness, and started working on basically how do you take this contextual understanding of how people move through the world and start building proactive kind of recommendations based on where you've been, who you are, your tastes, your social graph, and kind of that's where kind of the company evolved to, and then left earlier this year to join Slack and start up our New York City office.
Yeah. And yeah, Foursquare is an absolutely fascinating company from a data science standpoint. What a couple of years ago with Blake Shaw, I guess, who told us about what you guys were working on at the time. Is really quite fascinating. Yeah. So you joined Slack. So I guess tell us about Slack. So one of the great things about this audience is that it's not just sort of tech startup echo chamber. So Slack is I guess one of the fastest growing sort of enterprise company ever, but it's quite possible that some people have never heard of it or never seen it. So do you want to give us the 101?
Yeah, I guess I would be curious, could people raise their hands if they use Slack at their job? Oh God, that's probably over.
I'd take it back. Sorry,
so
everybody's heard of it.
I think we can safely say this is not a representative sample of the broader kind of working population, but it's great to see you. Thank you, New York.
Who has not heard of Slack? No, I'm just kidding. Don't.
All right, well, come.
It's not public shaming.
Drinks on me, you can find me later. Yeah, so Slack kind of started off, honestly, with kind of very humble mission. It's actually largely a Canadian co-founded company, so I think that kind of goes with their vibe, which is they want to make people's working lives simpler, more pleasant, and more productive. And quite frankly, it started out of this, I don't know how many people here know the history, but it was these 4 co-founders who had tried to build this online role-playing game back in the early 2000s.
What was it called? Tiny?
So Tiny Spec was the second time they tried to do that.
So it was
so
3 people.
There's a company called Ludicorp back in the day, or I think, and then out of that they kind of shut that down and built Flickr, and then sold Flickr to Yahoo, and then in 2009 they tried to do it again. Worked on it for 4 years, launched this game. The company was called Tiny Spec. The game was called Glitch. Critically acclaimed, but kind of was aiming at the desktop when everything was going to mobile, and games where you threw cows at each other and things like that. So the game never actually took off on the consumer side. But to build the game, they realized they had this distributed team. They had kind of SF, Vancouver, and New York. And they were trying to figure out how do we actually work together as a team. So kind of selfishly, they started basically enhancing all these things on top of IRC, which led to this proto version of Slack. And when they were thinking about, well, this game is not successful, we probably should just give our money back. Like, thank you, Andreessen, for all the support, but we don't know what to do with the money. Of course, they said, no, please, keep the money, take the time, figure out what to do. So lo and behold, they kind of said, well, maybe other people might want what we built as an internal prototype, and that's where Slack came from. And kind
one of those fascinating stories like Twitter from ODO and all the things where the byproduct ends up being the product.
Yeah, I mean, Stuart would be totally candid and say, Slack where it is today is a 99% kind of lucky outcome in terms of there was no manifest destiny of this is what we're going to build from day one. they were really kind of building for themselves so that they could collaborate better. And it turns out that kind of resonated with other companies that had similar kind of coordination, collaboration challenges.
Very cool. So any stats on Slack and how it's taking the world, starting with this room apparently?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this kind of sample is a kind of nice thing to see. You know, Slack, yeah, it's a very fast-growing company. I think our public stats are that we have passed over 3 million daily active users. So people are using the product literally every day. Those daily active users are using it for about 2 hours, over 2 hours a day, like actually foregrounded on their phone or on their desktop. They send over 60 messages a day. We have billions of messages sent every day. So, I mean, quite frankly, that's one of the reasons why we all were excited to kind of join to work at Slack at this point where there's definitely enough product market fit and enough kind of intensity of usage to start really doing interesting things about understanding the work graph and how people relate to each other and how people relate to channels, and also kind of understanding all this unstructured information that's passing through Slack just so people can get their job done. Can we start making sense of that? Can we start organizing it, ranking it, and feeding it back into people to make their working lives more productive? So that's kind of the moment in time that kind of bore out this group that we're starting here in New York, which is, yeah, like you said, called the Search Learning Intelligence Group.
And as a passing thought, like any idea why Slack is taking off now? Because the fundamental concept is not new, right? People have been trying to do something like this for a very long time, so why now?
Yeah, I remember seeing an interview with some of the YouTube co-founders from probably a decade ago, where someone was like, this was video hosting startup number 20. Why did number 19 not take off? I mean, I think there's a lot of small things that are actually quite different about the Slack product, and like most products, it's the kind of combination of a bunch of things from a bunch of different kind of historical sources like IRC with channels, mobile messaging on the consumer side, unfurling like you might see on Facebook, like all these different components kind of mixed together. I think that's a big part of it. I also think, quite frankly, there was a lot of macro trends that all kind of hit at the same time. And one of the big things that we've seen is on the enterprise side is really people's expectations of what enterprise software should be have kept increasing, and the whole world is moving from email for coordinating outside of work to something that's much more mobile and that's much more lightweight, like messaging. Slack comes along at kind of that point where multiple of these messaging services were reaching billions of users, and I think that plus the shift to mobile and just increasing expectations of enterprise software, that perfect storm happened, and Slack kind of found the right product market fit, and the rest kind of is history over the last 2 or so years.
Great. All right. So head of search and intelligence. I'm forgetting one.
Learning.
Learning.
Ambiguous words together that kind of.
So what does that mean? And then let's go into some two, I guess, of the key things that you work on.
I mean, the name itself comes from a text message thread between Stuart and I the week before I started. We're like, oh shit, we should name this thing before I actually start. Let's come up with something descriptive but not binding, hence those 3 words. What I would say is kind of the fundamental purpose of the group really is to take all this data that we have in Slack, this exhaust that's kind of coming out of people using it in a very collaborative way, and start figuring out how we can make Slack the product smarter and the companies that use it more productive, the more history they have. And when you look at companies that are using it, many are sending even millions of messages a day now. The volume of usage is pretty unparalleled, I think, in the enterprise. So that's what we kind of sought out to do. A fun historical and slightly public fact is that after they came up with the name Slack, the name was the name for many reasons, but they decided, well, it should also be an acronym because all short names should be acronyms. So the backronym that they came up with was that Slack stood for a searchable log of all conversation and knowledge. Which is incredibly ambitious, and I think the product still does not live up to that, but it kind of gives you a sense of where they thought Slack was heading, which was, one, not just communication, but also all these third-party kind of platform integrations, piping information into Slack and treating it like a kind of collective log for the company, and 2, making that information more useful over time and actually searchable so that you could find everything that your company cares about all in one place.
Right, so to dig in a little bit on that.
Yeah.
So you mentioned one key project is essentially search, so making everything searchable. So, so everything that's outside of Slack searchable from Slack?
Yeah, so I would say it starts off with just looking at the messages that are within Slack today. I don't know how many of you actually search regularly. It's a start, I would say. As Stuart might say publicly, it's kind of a piece of shit, but it works well enough. He's pretty deprecating about the product. Right now, it really works if you know exactly the message that you're looking for. So you remember maybe that someone said, all right, clarify, speaking event, and there's one message that you're looking for, and maybe you use some Boolean operators to find it. Obviously, that is not how the next set of people who are going to use Slack are used to searching. I think their expectations are kind of set in the consumer sphere, right? It's like they're used to being able to use Google, and they can type in a bunch of words, and optionalization will work, and synonymization will work, and it'll do query expansion, and all these things that just help you actually find what you're looking for. We're thinking about how to do that with all the information that's within Slack, starting with the messages that people actually type, and figuring out how to actually rank those so that you and I probably see very different results within an organization, and then moving on to people. So thinking about how to identify experts within an organization, because Slack is a communication tool for teams. Unlike Google, if you give someone as a result, an individual person, often that can be 80% of what someone's actually looking for. And then to channels, and then to files, and then eventually, to all the third-party integrations that we have. So if you're pumping in all your Salesforce CRM updates into the product, that should be searchable as a first-class kind of corpora of knowledge alongside the people and the messages and files within Slack. And it should all be fast. And sorry, it's so slow right now.
I mean, it's really quite fascinating. I mean, a little bit to the earlier question about the timing of why Slack works. I mean, what you described is, 15, 20-year-old industry that was once known as knowledge management.
Yeah.
The other part is enterprise search, and there was this whole cottage industry with the Verity, Autonomy, Fast, Deca, all those guys. And so it's a reinvention of that. Or
yeah, I guess what we think about a lot is people come to Slack initially because it's a great tool for collaborating with your team. They usually stick around because it's a way of integrating all these different workflows that you have and the dozens of third-party services that you use into one place, into one front end. And then what we hope they do is they stay long-term because of the ability for Slack to help you actually mine the knowledge of your organization and actually become more productive. But I think the fundamental model of Slack of it largely is public within a team in terms of channels, and pushing people to communicate in a more lightweight way, more frequently, and transparently to the rest of their organization, that opens up a whole set of kind of information that otherwise never existed. In the same way, in some ways, to Twitter providing a new tool for people to create real-time content on the web, and then being able to kind of understand what is happening in the world right now. Sometimes you have to change the actual tool of production to actually be able to deliver on some of those consumer search use cases.
Great. And so the second big area of focus that you had mentioned in our conversation prior to this was, should I call it personalization or learning or discovering what content is relevant to you? Yeah.
So I guess since so many people here use Slack, I'd be curious, if you're away for maybe a day or two and you're thinking about logging in for the first time, how many of you feel a little bit like that anticipation of being extremely overwhelmed by everything that you have to catch up on? It's okay, we won't be offended. All right, about half the folks. So a little bit depends on the size of the company. We see basically, as companies grow larger, not surprisingly, the volume of communication that's happening publicly within that company just keeps increasing. And obviously companies that are larger even have more coordination to do. So the number one thing that we get from customers is they say, I love Slack, I love the transparency, so much that I've started to hate the fact that I feel just completely overwhelmed by how much I have to keep up with. So the flip side to the pull search kind of functionality is, how do we basically help people focus their attention on what are the most important conversations for them to read? And again, with this lens that what you want to read and what I want to read are probably completely different. There might be some common data that can help direct us in the right way, but who I interact with, the channels that I care about, the topics that I care about, those are very unique kind of stamps that help us understand what are the things that we should put in front of you. And then over time, thinking about how to actually help people save time by catching up really quickly on the channels that they're in when they don't necessarily need to read every message. There are a few channels that people usually read kind of religiously throughout the day in real time, and then usually a bunch of channels that people read kind of casually, where you have that stress that there is this thing that you might want to catch up on, kind of like keeping up with Twitter, again, in some ways. But instead of having to literally read everything, can we actually surface to you, here's the 5 messages that we think are really critical out of the 50 that are there. If you want to read all 50, you can, but here are the 5 best.
And with that building up to a timeline, any sense of what the when all of this may be happening? Is that?
Yeah.
that 3 months? Is that 2 years?
Yeah, so a bunch of the folks who actually work on the team here in New York are in the room, so you could kind of pepper them with questions about when will this launch.
No pressure.
So I would say our kind of approach here is that we have these kind of North Stars for where we're going in terms of that product experience, but want to kind of do that very incrementally. So one of the things that we'll be launching soon is, a couple weeks ago we launched this thing called the All in Reds view, which is basically all your Slack channels and DMs grouped in order, alphabetical order for now, in one view. So if you need to quickly scan what's been happening, you can do that. But alphabetical is probably not the best sort if you're trying to catch up in a couple minutes, especially on mobile where like the median session length is 30 seconds. So what we're gonna be launching over the next couple weeks, and something we've been working on for a while, is the ability to actually re-rank what that unread view looks like. So the messages from the people and the channels that you care about the most will actually be on top. So you'll kind of hopefully read them in the priority order as they exist to you. And that's going to be the beginning, and then things will kind of roll out sequentially from there.
Great. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what's very specific about Slack data? There's a combination of, I guess, some is private, some is public within the company. Like, I think about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talk about this internally of like, what is the closest analog to Slack? Because it's this mix of, it's not Gmail or a private photo search. It's not completely private data, though there is certainly private data that only you can access. And it's definitely not all public data, as in kind of like Google Web Search or Foursquare local search. It's somewhere kind of in between. There's this organizational shared information. So when we think about it, we think a lot about like, what does the search experience look like versus maybe when you do something like Google Web Search. And some of the big differences are, obviously, there's the query distribution, when you think about it broken out by team, there's no head, right? Like if you append kind of team equals Slack or team equals FirstMark, there is no head of that query stream across all teams. Whereas Google, on the other hand, they have a distinct head that they can use a lot of click feedback on that we don't benefit from. The other kind of big thing is I think a lot of the queries on services like, imagine a Spotify, when you type in Adele, it's very clear that you're looking for Adele. Even for more complex queries on Google, when you type in something like Donald Trump tax returns, it's a very clear query. You might not be able to find the answer, but like the query's intent is unambiguous. Whereas on Slack, we kind of view it as almost every query is inherently ambiguous because the lens that you're looking through is quite different. So imagine you're working at Google, you work on the Android team, someone else works on the Chrome team. When you type in on OKRs on the Android team versus the Chrome team, you're actually looking for a completely different set of results. So that lens where the personalization is kind of at the foremost of the ranking signals is quite different, and we have very, very rich information that we can use for what are you interested in, who are the people that you trust, what are the channels that you care about the most, to be able to do that kind of ranking.
Great. So in the world of data and AI, one concept that comes back a lot in conversation is Slack bots. Which I know you guys don't build, but you host them and you create the platform. So how do you think about them? Which ones are you excited about?
Yeah.
Where is all of this going?
Right. So yeah, I mean, our general approach with Slack is we want 1,000 or 10,000 flowers to bloom, especially on the Slack platform, in terms of people building apps for getting work done with Slack as the front end. So we launched in December kind of our version of an app store. And since then, about 600 apps have been published, largely all kind of bots of some sort. I think we're excited to see kind of what those early experiences look like. Quite frankly, I think a lot of them are still in more of the like interesting kind of toy phase in terms of the sophistication. They're not kind of fully robust tools, but I think the early traction is quite interesting. I think you got to separate also the motivation from developers versus the end user. I think a lot of the excitement about bots in general, not just on Slack, on Messenger, on all these other services, is developers are really fed up with trying to actually get adoption and distribution for the service that they're building. It's impossible to get notes on the App Store. Writing for multiple mobile platforms and the web is a huge pain. The open-ended kind of UI that you're able to use is also, you wish there was more constraints. So in some ways, bots are kind of a harken back to, well, yeah, write once, run anywhere. Distribution is much easier, one-click install. So I think there's a lot of motivations on the developer side. I think it's still super early in terms of people figuring out, both the technical and the product design patterns that will work well for building these conversational interfaces. So we're excited to see what happens, but it's still quite early.
And any one or two that come to mind in terms of doing interesting things?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch that we see kind of in the Slack ecosystem that we're kind of excited about, from things that are more technically simple, but I think are kind of delightful. Like there's a company called Growbot that is building kind of an app to give kind of positive reinforcement within the workplace. There's a company in New York that we've invested in through our Slack fund, just raised another round a couple weeks ago, called Troops, which is kind of building like an intelligent CRM that's a kind of conversational interface to start with. So there's a lot of interesting things. The other thing that we see a lot is at larger companies, we certainly do this at Slack, people write kind of their own custom integrations to plug into their back-end systems. So we do this for pretty much every stats system that we have, is a bot that kind of emits regularly different kinds of alerts. And I think the companies that wind up loving Slack the most, they basically take all these really ugly internal tools that they have that no one ever wants to log into anyway, and they start just kind of connecting those pipes into Slack. And that's something that winds up being a kind of magical experience for them.
So bots is an interesting trend. Another interesting trend is the consumerization of the enterprise, which Slack is sort of the poster child.
Yeah. What do I think? I mean, I guess I would say I don't think I ever grew up telling my parents I was excited to work on enterprise software. That was never like a hope or dream of mine. No offense to enterprise software developers. I actually love it. It's amazing. Most people at Slack have never worked at enterprise software before. If I had to guess, I would say 90% of people had only worked on consumer software like Flickr or Facebook or Foursquare, Twitter, or Google, whatnot. So Slack kind of fundamentally is like software built by people who are novices building software for businesses, but they're really good at building software for people. We just happen to be building for people who are at work. And I think that's a big change in perspective, that people's expectations of software that they're using in the enterprise now are kind of mirroring what they're seeing on the consumer side, because there's a lot more kind of a bottoms-up support for kind of deploying tools. So most of Slack's deployments don't start with the CIO doing a security review and saying, I approve Slack for deployment. It normally is the opposite, which is a bunch of groups start using it, they're using their personal credit cards, and then eventually the CIO finds out, and he calls us up and he says, what is the Slack thing and how do I turn it off? And we're like, wait a second, this might be something you'd be interested in deploying more widely. So when we see consumerization of the enterprise, what we think about is both the product experience itself and people's kind of bar for, they use WhatsApp or Messenger or iMessage in their personal life. You want it to work as fluidly in your working life when you think about something like Slack. And then also kind of the bar for like what a search experience should look like. If you're used to using Google and all the ways that you can type in inane queries and find exactly what you're looking for, if your enterprise search doesn't work that same way, you're kind of violating those expectations. So how do we, as more kind of data-driven products are released to consumers, how do we kind of build similar products like that for the enterprise? And that's what we're really excited about. I think that's what companies are excited about, is the potential kind of productivity gains from having that same approach that people took to make Spotify's Discover Weekly playlist or Google Now or the Facebook news feed. What if those same types of approaches were taken on the enterprise side?
Great. You mentioned earlier in the conversation that Slack at the very beginning was a distributed company before it became distributed. And so Slack is headquartered in San Francisco, but you're based here, and you're building this team here. So is that circumstantial? Is that like, is this great guy, let's have him, and it'll be a team in New York, or is there something special about New York?
It's a good question. I would say there's probably historical, corporate, and personal reasons for why we started up the team in New York. I mean, one historical is, Slack started off, there was 4 co-founders. One of the first person to be in New York actually before I joined was actually Eric Costello, who is effectively the tech lead for the front end of Slack. He's worked from New York for the 15 years since before Flickr, and 2 other co-founders, including the CEO, were in Vancouver, and one who's now the CTO, Cal Henderson, is in San Francisco. So one, it's kind of path dependent a little bit. Slack only exists because they have this distributed team. I would say the corporate side is, many of the biggest customers that already exist for Slack or will exist in the future all exist in this New York City kind of region or the Northeast region. Quite frankly, based on the survey in the room, you can probably tell we've reached almost saturation in San Francisco and the Bay Area in terms of companies using Slack. So most of I think the growth will happen in other parts of the world, and this is kind of the economic engine of the rest of the country. So we were always going to kind of come up with an enterprise office here. But I think what I saw having worked at Google, worked at Foursquare is that there's a tremendous kind of imbalance, I think, between people who are probably kind of sitting in this room who are really capable and excited to work on kind of data-driven product development, and I think equally exciting opportunities versus what you see in the Bay Area. So part of the reason we were all excited to build Foursquare in New York was we wanted to create a new company from scratch that had those kind of challenges. And now at Slack, I think we get to do that, but standing on the shoulders of a kind of company that's growing even much faster and has even a richer set of data. So we kind of hoped that we could build this kind of company and build this kind of group within the New York kind of ecosystem where, quite frankly, I think there's less of those types of exciting opportunities, and we're happy to bring that here to New York. As a native New Yorker, I'm personally biased to make that happen, and we're opening up our full-time office in December right by Astor Place in Lafayette, so we're setting down permanent roots.
Great. Well, the last question from me, and then we'll open up to people. So tell us precisely about that. What kind of team are you building? Are you looking for data scientists, data engineers? So who's already on the team? Yeah,
so we've got about 7 folks here in New York. Most of them, I think, are here today, except for one who's in California. They're, what I would say is kind of engineers who have 1 or 2 kind of superpowers from past lives or past jobs, either working on search-like problems or working on kind of large-scale data processing or working on things more on the machine learning and data science side. Like New York, we kind of want this team to be a melting pot of different kind of capabilities, where the types of problems we're working on are so kind of just forming. There's so much greenfield in all these different directions that it's not like we're trying to optimize as one very specific problem. So kind of having generalists, but who all have kind of different complementary skill sets in that area is really important. We're also hiring product managers and probably designers in the next 6 months or so. So kind of building this kind of fully cross-functional autonomous team to focus on making Slack, the tool, kind of smarter and companies more productive the more they use it.
Great, very cool. Yeah. Thank you very much. All right, so we have one question here.
Hi, thanks a lot.
Sure.
One of the things I really love about Slack is how easy it is to log in, right? With the magic link, I just get the magic link, click it, and then I can have access to it on my phone. If you guys are really moving towards a fully indexable knowledge base of all the knowledge in the company, how do you see that evolving in terms of user authentication if it's going to be really difficult? Or is it worth it to make that process more difficult through authentication, or are you just going to leave it the way it is?
Sorry, you're wondering, should we make the process more difficult?
Well, not more difficult, but more secure, right? Is it worth it to add something like biometrics to that if it's going to make the login process more difficult?
Yeah, part of that is something that you can kind of configure at the administrative level. So whether you want to use SSO provider, or soon there'll be different IDP providers like Okta. We've got 7 layers of like Duo and 2-factor authentication set up internally. So it's kind of up to the company to decide how they want to configure that. I think, yeah, it is true. Slack is definitely one of the more sensitive systems that people give access to. So security and having the right levels of controls is definitely something that we're building towards, so enterprises can configure it the way that they want.
Very cool. We probably have time for one more. Okay, can really see from here. Okay, I'll take this one. Okay, so just last one.
Hi, I heard you say what kind of team you're building. What kind of sales team are you building?
We are also building a sales team. So yeah, I was just with them earlier today around Midtown talking to large companies that want to use Slack. They're building out a team basically with account executives, so people who are actually doing more of the kind of early stage kind of selling and understanding of customer needs, and then also we have a really big kind of customer success group. So kind of, we jokingly call them like our organizational therapists. So they go in, understand how customers want to use Slack, want to run their company, and kind of help them with that change management and with that kind of adoption. So yeah, we're hiring a sales team too. Slack.com/jobs has those positions listed as well.
All right, very cool. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Matt.